Welcome back. I cannot tell you how delighted I am, all of us at the John Adams Institute, our team, that we can finally have live events again. We are so happy to see you. We're so happy that you're here. And we're also so happy that you have been so loyal to us during this year and a half in which our entire program has gone online. And I wanted to say a word about that strange and unforgettable time. Before I do that, let me remind you that my name is Tracy Metz, and I'm the director of the John Adams. This has been, of course, for all of us, and especially for the people who have lost their lives, their health, everything, a strange and difficult time. But also, of course, for the cultural world, and for an institute like ours that is completely dependent on bringing people physically from the US to Europe. Our mission is to bring the best and the brightest of American thinking. And all of a sudden we couldn't. So we went online, and on the one hand it's kind of dry and dull and impersonal. You're just sitting behind a screen. A lot of people sit behind a screen all day anyway, looking at someone talking. And as someone said to me yesterday, you know, it's so hard to stop your attention from wandering. But at the same time, our YouTube channel subscriptions have gone through the roof. We've reached a much bigger international audience, and we have been able to invite people to speak for us, for the Institute, whom we would never be able to get to Europe. We had a fantastic event with Dr. Fauci. He's 81. I don't think he would have jumped on a plane, and he was too busy anyway. It's been a time of mixed blessings, and I guess for all of us that's true. But I can tell you one thing for sure, I'm glad it's over. We're moving forward, and how better to move forward than with our very own Russell Shorto. Russell, of course, is the previous director of the John Adams Institute. It was he who roped me into doing this, and I've been grateful to him ever since. And we know him, of course, as the author of many wonderful books. The last time he was physically here at the John Adams was to talk about his book about the American Revolution, the Revolution Song, in a aula of the University of Amsterdam packed with people. It seems like an event from another epoch now, doesn't it? And now he's back to talk about his book, Smalltime, which has been translated for Ambo Anthos as Pater Familias, het verhaal van mijn familie en de gangsters. Goed gekozen. And we hebben vanavond, and we have with us together here this evening the translator. And I would like him to stand up, Jan Willem Reitsma. And I asked him just now, when he told me that he was the translator, I said, oh, this must have been a wonderful book to translate. The language is so rich and creamy, and of course you hear the Italian accent through so much of it as well. And what did you say, Jan Willem?
Yeah, it was actually. He did pose a very special problem in that he does a sort of info dump at the start of sentences in a way that Dutch doesn't really tolerate. So
that is your problem. Yeah. So it's great that you're here, and thank you for making sure that this is accessible to a Dutch audience as Pater Familias. And please, if you speak Dutch, do buy the Dutch edition, because it is so important that publishers like Ambo Anthos are still able to translate books like this. And if we don't buy them, they'll stop, and then we'll have a problem. So do the right thing. I don't want to give away too much, because after this, Russell will give a talk and then also read a fragment of the book, and then we'll have a conversation. And after that, we'll come to you with questions, although you'll have to stand up and shout, because we don't have microphones that can reach the entire hall. I found it such a surprisingly enriching experience reading this book, and also very emotional. I had heard what it was about, and I thought, oh, that's fun. Russell has done sort of something in between about his own family and this picturesque story of his family and the mob. And it turned out to be so different. There were so many aspects to this story that really took me by surprise. And no spoilers, but I will admit that the last chapter made me cry. And it is, it's such a rich story, and it's also a special thing for Russell, and I'm sure he'll say something about that. He writes history, and that has always been history of 1600s, 1700s. And now all of a sudden, he wrote a book. It took him at least 4 years. But he, for the first time, has written a book about living people, living history. And I'm very curious to hear from him how that felt and how that has changed his feeling about writing and about writing about your own family, which has a million possible obstacles and crevices that I'm sure you all, that you met all of them along the way. We'll hear all about that this evening, and I want to give him the floor. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Russell, for doing the inaugural post-corona event.
If there's a place I can put this.
Yeah.
I'll try this.
Not really.
No? Okay. Well, then I'll hold it.
Okay.
Hi. Hello. I'm so happy to be here. So happy to see all of you. Thank you, Tracy and Martin and Mika, the John Adams, for inviting me. There's so many friends, familiar faces here. Mari, Kobe, Tilly de Groot is here somewhere. I've been here for a week, and I hadn't been back in since before the aforementioned pandemic, and it's been like coming home. So it's been a wonderful week. As Tracy said, looked at from one perspective, it's just what the world needs, right? Another book about the American mafia. A review in the U.S., I think it was the Wall Street Journal, began with this long paragraph, basically saying, how many books about the American mafia can we possibly tolerate? And then they went into, mafia overload for this long paragraph. Then the next paragraph basically began, this is really different. But as an author, of course, I'm thinking, you probably lost half the audience in that first paragraph. So, but that's what, that's one reason that I wanted to write this, because I saw that there was a really different story here. As a writer of history, you look for stories that are familiar. That's what I like most. Looking at a familiar story, but it's like an object, and if you turn it a little, it suddenly looks different. You're looking at it from the back or from the side. And that's what this was to me, because you all know the story of the American mafia, which is what the story that I knew or thought I did. And that is the story from the perspective of New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and, gangland murders and all of that. So my grandfather, to cut to the chase, ran the mob in my hometown, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was a small steel town in western Pennsylvania near, Mika, thank you very much. Now I have a place to put my water. So a place like Johnstown, 70,000 people at its height. And yet it had a branch, a branch office of the mob. And I learned as I went into this story that so did Scranton, which isn't too far away. So did Altoona, Pennsylvania, which is about 40 miles away. So did Cumberland, Maryland, where I live now. So did Morgantown, West Virginia, and Amarillo, Texas, and Fresno, California. Any town of any size, practically, in the U.S., had a mob outfit. And I learned as I researched the mob that the people who founded the American mafia came over and were really enamored of American capitalism, of people like Henry Ford and Frick and Carnegie. And those guys were, if you look into that kind of business, what did they do? They bulldozed their way forward. They paid off politicians. They made things work for them. And one thing they did is they opened branch offices in corporations. And that is exactly what the mob did. So what characterized small-town mob versus the large city is, I'll go into it in a bit, but there's an overlap, but it's also something quite different. And it was so pervasive that I eventually came to the conclusion that this was simply truly a part of the American system in the 20th century. I mean, my grandfather and his brother-in-law essentially ran the town from 1945, the end of the war, into the 1960s. They paid off the mayor. They had a business, a storefront that was 2 doors from City Hall, and the mayor would come in every day, and he'd leave with an envelope in his pocket, and the police would get paid off, and they ran their candidate for district attorney, and so this was what was going on everywhere in America. It was really part of the system. Okay. As Tracy said, I have made my living for a long time now, writing nonfiction narrative history set a long time ago. I wrote about the Dutch founding of New York and a book about the American Revolution. And this started, I want to say 8 years ago, something like that. I was living in Amsterdam at the time, at the John Adams Institute, and I was home for Christmas, and my mother's cousin was in town as well. It was a couple days after Christmas, and we have this. There aren't many ways, I guess, that the vestiges of an Italian background are present. But big family, lots of people gathered together at Christmas. That remains. So we're all in my parents' living room, and this was after Christmas, and it was evening, and somebody mentions that Frankie's in town. And I said, "Who's Frankie?" And they said, "Frank Filia, your mom's cousin." And Frank was and is still a jazz musician. He's 86 or 87 now. He had been a musician in town, but back in the day, he had worked for my grandfather. He was a numbers runner, and he ran a pool hall for him. And then he moved to Las Vegas, and he had his whole career in Las Vegas. He plays the stand-up bass and sings, "Fly Me to the Moon," and all those kind of songs. And so he had his whole career there, and he had retired and come home. So he was playing at a local club, and so a group of us go down to hear him. And I have to tell you that I had always known that somehow that my grandfather ran the mob or was involved with the mob somehow. Nobody talked about it, and yet you know how children, whatever the dark secret is in the family, children come to know it even though nobody talks about it. So I absorbed that fact, but I also absorbed the idea that we don't talk about this. So it just kind of stayed there, just sat somewhere in my mind. And all these people who I was with that Christmas they lived in town, and if you stayed in town, you, I think, internalized that silence. So we all go down to see Frank, and in this little combo, and then there's a break, and he comes and joins us, and we're all standing around in a circle, and at one point he looks across the circle at me, and he goes like this, and he says, "Russell, you're the writer. What are we going to do about the story?" And I said, "What story?" And he said, "What story? Your grandfather, the mob." And all my relatives kind of do this. And I did too, because we're all, trained to. But Frank had left so long ago that to him, these were just great stories and great memories. So I pushed him away. I said, "Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that's a good idea. But that's not what I do. I do real history. I do, But he kept pushing, and he said, if you want to get serious about this. So I thought about it. I came back to Amsterdam, and I thought about it. I couldn't let go of it, but I told myself that I write history. I don't make things up. I know perfectly well that those guys are dead and gone, and they did not leave notebooks behind or anything like that. So what am I going to base it on, So finally, though, I decided I would go back for a week just to explore this. And I did, and I called him, and he said, meet me at my hangout. His hangout was, and still is, Panera Bread, which is kind of comic because Panera Bread is like the modern franchise version of Italian hangout. And so I met him there, and I turned on my recorder on my phone, and he started, I asked him a question, and he started talking about back in the day. And some other old guy came up and sat down, and then another one. And eventually there were 8 of them around. So he had put out the word. He said, come on, you gotta do this for me. So I realized that so my grandfather, that generation were gone. But these guys who are now 80 or older had been the young guys in town who looked up to them and wanted to be them. And they, soaked in everything that was going on. No lie, 4 hours later, I hit stop on the recorder. And I said, okay, there is definitely something here. Because it was 4 hours of really fun, interesting, sometimes dark stories about, kind of an underworld. And I felt it was different from, the standard stories you get because it was kind of from inside. These people had worked in this, some of them anyway, had worked in it. But I do history. This is me talking to myself. I do history. These are old guys remembering things that happened 60 years ago or more. How reliable are they? So then, though, I was comfortable doing the next level of research, which is my father at the time was friends with the chief of police. He gave me my own key to the records room at the police department, the local police. I spent a weekend there. I went to my father and I actually together made a very memorable father-son trip to the county courthouse where we wrote out the paper to request my grandfather's, his father's arrest records. And we got this big stack of arrest records. And I will never forget, my father looked at this and he said, well, I'll be a son of a bitch. And I knew exactly what he meant because my father, he was the oldest son of my grandfather. And he, how you see something from the inside starting as a small child and you have no distance from it. You can't say, oh, this is the American mafia operating in a small town setting. It was just life, it was his father. And so he saw a lot, but here in front of us in this stack, it was kind of confirmed officially for the first time for him, for my father. So I'll be a son of a bitch. So I did a lot of that kind of work. The local newspaper, they opened up their archives to me. And I was able to take those stories and match them up with documentation, and say, okay, we're getting somewhere here. The next step was to do something that I hadn't done before, was to really do oral history, of the town as much as I could. People who were alive, who remembered things back in the day, starting with my own family, of course. And it's a very strange thing that I undertook this, I began this, trying to ignore my father's presence. And I now know why I was doing that, because I was telling myself that this can still be a history the way I normally write history. In other words, I don't have to be too closely connected to it. I can tell the history of the small town mob with this focus on this little town, which of course is ridiculous. My grandfather's name was Russell Shorto. I was named after him, so I was looking for probably the only other person in the world with that name. So finally what happened was my father got very ill. He had been in bad health, and he got very ill. We thought we were going to lose him. And then he came back. He got better. He was back out of the hospital. He came home. And so I said, all right, I can't pass up this opportunity. And so I said to him, Dad, do you want to work on this with me? And he said yes, right away. My father and I are sort of opposites. I tend to be kind of cautious and feeling my way along. He's a very open person, and he immediately wanted to do this and wanted me to do it and do it as fully as possible. So he worked with me, and the way we would work was, and this is one reason that I moved back actually from Amsterdam, was to work on this book, but also for family reasons and other reasons. But so typically I'd go where I live now is an hour from my parents. I'd drive in, we'd spend the morning together, have lunch together, and we'd talk. And I'd turn on the recorder, and my parents would, start talking about things, and a name would come up, and I'd say, well, I've never heard of that person. And my dad would pick up his flip phone and, call the person and say, are you home? We're coming over. And so, we'd go over there and talk to that guy, and that guy would give somebody else's name. And so I eventually did something like 250 hours of interviews with people in the town, in my family, but then extending outward and outward in this network. And there were a couple of key moments, one of which was when I discovered a man who I didn't know existed, but he lived, I'd say, less than a kilometer from my parents. And he was my grandfather's right-hand man. He was somewhat older than my dad, but he was really kind of the son. My grandfather, in a way, this is one layer of the story, treated this kid, when he was a kid, as his son, more than he did his own son. So there was, I started to realize once I met him and he opened up to me, and when he sat down and said, this were his first words: everything you heard about Russ, put it in the ash can. He talked like he was from Brooklyn. He wasn't from Brooklyn, but so he said nobody knew Russ like I did. So you're in for some information. So moments like that, of course, as a writer or researcher, when you're doing this, are just golden, because my family had this perception of my grandfather, which was largely based on the fact that he had done a lot of sort of psychic damage to the family. I think he didn't know what to do with all this power that he amassed, and he became this, at times, he would become this just roaring drunk, and he became this really terrible womanizer, just serial affairs. And so those things really, more than, I think my family could have lived with the fact that he was involved in illegal operations. But those things in any family, a lot of this, of what happens in this book, has nothing to do really with the mob. It's just families, and when you get into those stories. So because of that, this became, people in my family looked back on him with this kind of, heaviness. And I, as a child, picked up on that, because children absorb what the adults are feeling. So the way I went about this, the big challenge I discovered early on was that my grandfather was a very quiet, I think almost pathologically shy man. So people didn't have stories in which he said much. It was hard for me to, I became so frustrated. I'm looking for this person, and he's not saying anything. Eventually, then, I decided that what I had to do was go back a step. So I actually took my family to Sicily, to the village that his parents were from, and the local historian, a man named Mario Italiano, helped us out. He had found all the records on my family, and the house my great-grandfather was born in, which was built in the 1400s. It was just a ruin on the edge of town. So we did this wonderful, after dinner in Italy, you do passeggiata, where you walk around. Everybody in the neighborhood walks around after dinner in the evening air. So we did passeggiata, and he's saying to everybody, my son Anthony was a little boy, and he's saying, "Questo Antonino Shorto," and he's returned, and people. It turned out there were a lot of people with the original last name, Shorto, Sciotto. So that was a really fruitful for me background experience. First, because of that immediate family connection and getting a real sense of place. It's this little village way up in the hills above Messina, where Mario and another local historian told me that until I think in the 70s is when they got running water. I mean, now it's they've got everything, but you can feel how primitive it was not terribly long ago. But also then doing the backstory on the history and realizing that around the turn of the 20th century, you have these massive waves of immigrants from southern Italy, as well as other places, of course, to America. So in the 1860s, the Civil War ends. You have all these African Americans who are freed as slaves, and suddenly these plantation owners need workers. 1870 in Italy, it's the Risorgimento, and it's the start of the Italian nation, and the northern Italians proceed to dominate and subjugate almost southern Italy. And huge poverty in southern Italy. These, starting with these plantation owners in America, they advertise for workers, and that's what starts this flow. Then the next big group was coal mines that opened up. And so my great-grandfather, as a young man, emigrated from the village, first to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and then to Johnstown. And so then he and my great-grandmother started a family there. They eventually had 9 children. It occurs to me now that the American mob, meaning the Italian mafia, is a result of a couple of forces. One is what I just described, this wave of immigration, when millions came in a very short time, immediately followed by a wave of discrimination, because America at the time was, Americans thought of themselves as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And here were these waves of Catholics from southern Italy, from Poland, from Ireland. And they thought they were being, the Pope was taking over or something. So you have, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan starts up again. It had been all about, repressing blacks, but now it's about repressing Catholics from Europe. And so you have this enormous discrimination. In Johnstown, for example, the steel mills wouldn't hire blacks or Italians. And so that really puts pressure on these communities, these immigrant communities, and it wasn't just Italians, to fend for themselves, look out for themselves. My great-grandfather, the immigrant, dies. He was actually murdered. And then the wife, my great-grandmother, is now trying to raise 9 children, and my grandfather is the first male, and he's growing up with this in these circumstances. This is how I slowly came around to not having a more nuanced sense of who he was. Not just this dark figure that I knew, but what choice did he have? That kind of thing as he was growing up. So he grows up on the streets during Prohibition when alcohol was illegal for 10 years in America. And so that's kind of gives these Italian networks their first opportunity to act like corporations. They create their own methods of making and supplying alcohol. Then by the time Prohibition ended, they already knew what their next game was going to be, and that was gambling, because gambling was enormously popular and incredibly frowned on. So my grandfather then, he's hanging out on the streets. He's befriended by a couple of people that I learned a good bit about who taught him not only gambling, but I think my grandfather's real forte was as a cheat. He was a con man. And he was really good at dice and at manipulating cards. My father remembers being very small and watching his father at the dining room table before he'd have a big poker game, practicing, like dealing the second card, you know, without it being seen, or dealing from the bottom of the deck. So he becomes a figure in the town. His first arrest records were for running gambling games out of the trunk of a car. So he knows the town at that level. What I talked about before with this opening branch offices, that is starting to happen now. And a man in Philadelphia is given Johnstown. And so he shows up one day, and he falls in love with this girl. Downtown, there was a little shop there that was called the Dewdrop Inn that she worked in, and he fell in love with her, and she was my grandfather's sister. So he comes in town with this commission to open kind of a branch office to do gambling operations and so on. And here's his new brother-in-law who knows the town at that level. So they formed a partnership. The core of their business was this place that they called City Cigar, which was a cigar shop and a pool hall. And upstairs, they had the offices where everybody brought the money and where they operated from. And it was, as I say, right next to 2 doors from City Hall. And from 1945 or so into the 60s, they raked in millions of dollars. They rose very quickly. They were very skilled at organizing it. The operations were, they had high stakes card games for the owners of the jewelry stores and the factories and the department stores, where they would, my grandfather would take money from them. And they ran the numbers game. Are you familiar with the numbers operations? It was really common in the U.S. As a form of gambling that everybody played. People told me more than half the town played. And you would pick 3 numbers, and there were different ways that you could combine them. And depending on how you combined them and how much money you put down, you could win a lot of money. So it was a simple kind of number lottery. It started in Harlem among blacks, and that was because blacks and banks didn't trust each other in those days. Black people couldn't get a mortgage, and they didn't trust banks. So they actually saw the numbers game was called a bank, and they really looked at it in a way as kind of a bank. So they were gambling, but from their mind, what they were doing was, every day I'm going to put a nickel on the same number, whatever the 3-digit number is. And I'm going to lose my nickel every day for a year or 5 years. But then one day, it's going to come back, in spades. And there will be my investment. I'll get the return on my investment. So they saw it as kind of a bank that you didn't have to go to a building for. So the Italians in New York took over the numbers game from the blacks in Harlem. And then it spread with them as they spread around the country. And Russ, my grandfather, started something that he called the GI Bank. And I think it was a little marketing ploy, because it's 1945, troops are coming back from the war, and the GIs are the regular troops, So I think it may have felt like in some way you were supporting the troops by paying your money to the mob. So they ran numbers. They had pinball machines. You could bet on pinball machines, all sorts. And then beyond that, they would pinball machines, for example. Businesses of all kinds had them, hotel lobbies and so on. And you could gamble you gambled on it, and my grandfather and his brother-in-law, their company split the take with the business owner, the bar or whatever it was. And then the next step would be, if somewhere down the line the owner of that business was having a hard time making his rent or something, we'll loan you the money, we'll pay it. And then eventually they'd take a piece of the business in exchange. So they owned a lot of different kinds of businesses in town. It was mostly gambling, and it was I talked before about the difference between the small town mob and big cities. I think the big difference is relative lack of violence. Now, if you've read the book, you know there's a murder right in the middle of the book, and it was a bookie who was murdered, and he had worked for my grandfather. So, yeah, I mean, there was some violence, but relatively speaking, there was little. And I think that's just because in a small town, you're involved in the whole community. And the police, the mayor, whoever, they will tolerate it if everything is okay. But if things start to get ugly, then they're going to have to crack down. And in fact, that's what happens, I think, in Johnstown and elsewhere, that things started to get out of hand, and then they had to crack down. And that was sort of the beginning of the end for it. What I ended up doing was writing this story that is, I suppose, equal parts history, the history of that era in America, and of how ordinary it was, and memoir. And it really kind of came home to me. Once I was finished with the first draft, I was still in my mind thinking that what I was doing was writing history. And my editor at Norton, we were having a conversation about, the next steps with the book and, table of contents and things like that. And she said, well, what about an index? And I said, what do you mean? Because I write history, and history books always have an index at the end, so you can look things up. And she said, well, history books have an index, but memoirs don't. And this was her very delicate way of suggesting to me that, maybe what I had been slowly doing was moving toward writing a memoir. So I thought about it a little bit, and then I emailed her later, and I said, Julia, you're right. No index. This is a memoir. So it became a really very personal book because it was about, first of all, it was about the relationships between one generation and another of males, in this case, Italian-American males. First, the immigrant, the great-grandfather, and his relationship with his son, my grandfather, and then my grandfather and his relationship with my father, who had been helping me. And it was difficult but rewarding to do that aspect of it because I knew perfectly well that my father and my grandfather had a very difficult relationship. They never spoke for much of my father's adult life. And I came to know early on that the cause of that was back there. It had to do with all of this stuff. And then it ultimately, of course, became about my relationship with my father as we're, working on this material together. So I have come to be a big believer in doing family history. So what I'm saying to all of you, too, is, find the oldest person in your family, turn on a tape recorder, start asking them stories, because once it's gone, it's gone. And that's, somebody last night asked me, was it hard to get people to talk? Some people didn't want to talk, but for the most part, at a certain point, I think people feel that all these things they have been holding on to, once they're gone, it's going to be gone, And so you have to, and maybe they're just waiting for someone to ask them. They're not going to bring it up because they think you don't care. But there's just a world of stuff out there. Every story is a family story, Hamlet is about a son and his relationship with his parents. Romeo and Juliet is about two warring families. So, when you get into it, when you get into your family story, it has worlds in it. So, okay, let me do a quick, I'll read a couple of pages of the book, and then Tracy and I can talk, and we'll open it up. What I thought I would read is a section in which Frank, my mother's cousin who brought me into all this, is telling me why he wanted me to write it. And he told me this story. It was an Indian summer morning in 1951, and Frank Filia was 16, walking down Main Street, aglow and alive and surging with all the possibility that this precise moment held for him. The night before, he'd summoned his courage, walked into the Clinton Street pool room, and asked the boss, Yank Croco, for a job. Yank stared at the kid for a minute and said, okay. He could help out in the place, maybe run some numbers. 100 a week. Come back in the morning. And here he was on his first assignment. Go down to the newsstand and pick up the racing form. Even the price of it set this work apart. 35 cents. The regular newspaper cost a nickel. Then he heads back, opens the place up, takes the covers off the pool tables, cleans the felt, makes sure the chalk is stocked and the cue sticks are on their racks. He opens the paper, reads through the day's races, and calls the office above City Cigar to get the scratches from Johnny Oswald. Scratches are when a horse wasn't going to run. One of Russ's main guys. Johnny's been at it for hours already. By now, he knows which horses aren't running. Frank has to get the numbers of those horses so he can inform the bettors. First time Frank calls Johnny for scratches, Johnny corrects him on how to do it. First number, 23. Number 23. Wait a minute. Don't repeat after me. Just write them down. Okay, but I was told to repeat. You repeat when a guy's placing a bet. Guy says, give me San Francisco -3 for $20. You say, San Francisco -3 for 20. But when I'm giving you the scratches, you just listen and write. But this moment, even before he starts, when he's strutting down the street, about to start his first day on the job, is the one that stands out. I honestly think that was the happiest day of my life, says Frank, a man in his 80s who has lived a life of considerable hardship, shot through with thin veins of sweetness, a life grounded on the philosophy of the gambler. I was 16, walking down the street, the sun is shining, and I'm thinking, I'm in the mob. He quit school on the spot, $100 a week. That was what a middle-aged journeyman millwright at Bethlehem Steel earned, a union guy with a wife and family. Frank said that that morning was the first time he understood what a city was. He saw the town as a machine made of many parts that fit perfectly together, an organism. You had the mills powering it all, the workers streaming into the gates with their hard hats and lunch buckets. Over there was the Woolworth's lunch counter, where all the teenagers took their dates. Next to it, the jewelry store, where a few years later, those same guys, now working in the mill, bought rings for the girls they'd made up their mind to propose to. And the realtor, where you went when you were ready to buy a house. The furniture store, to fill it. The place you bought clothes and things for babies. The schools. Even the store that sold you your gravestone. Every damn thing fit together. And he was part of it now, because the mob was part of it. Everyone knew that. Everyone played the numbers, the pinball machines, the tip seals. They provided hope, exhilaration. They were the juice. Frank told me that was why he'd pressed me to write this book. He didn't want it to die and be gone forever. That moment, his realization, the beauty of the Clinton Street pool room, of the sweating and swearing men, the throaty laughter laced with menace, the lumbering bodies that suddenly became artful in bending over a table, the cue sticks angling like swords, of Red Piccolo declaring he'd get a machine gun and wipe out all the motherfuckers, 300-pound Joe Bruno, who would make the guys guffaw when he'd take a couple of hot dogs with him to the toilet, the guy who thought he was a wolf man, the drunk who would stagger into the pool room and declare that he was going to invent perpetual motion. I didn't know what the hell that meant, Frank said, but I just loved it. The human thing. One time somebody took me to the ballet. I said, what the hell is this? Then all of a sudden it hit me. They're speaking with their bodies. It was a wonderful world back then. It still is. Thanks, everybody. So, have a seat. I'll bring my water. Do you want to get your copy?
Yeah, just in case.
Thank you, Mika.
Thank you also for reading a section, Russell, because I think the language is so rich in this book, as I mentioned, that it's wonderful to hear your voice while reading it.
Well, it was fun to, working with living people, to try to capture their voices,
Yeah. This book was full of surprises for me, and I wanted talk with you about some of those surprises. And it's, as you said, a generational story, but also an immigration story, the great American story. And perhaps that touched me also so much because my grandfather was also an immigrant, not from Italy, but from Latvia. As far as I know, he didn't have as hard a time as your family did, but I was shocked by the stories of the discrimination that that the Italians suffered because they came in such large numbers and because they were Catholic. And I must say, I had to think of the great acrimony that we have in our society as well, with large waves of immigrants with a different religion. There were definite, it resonated with me.
It was so, I mean, researching this book during the Trump years and this, Make America Great and Let's Stop Immigrants and all that, it was, and reading, newspaper accounts written in the 1920s about these parades of Ku Klux Klan, thousands of them in their white outfits and the headgear, and parading down Fifth Avenue in New York and in Washington and in Johnstown. I mean, it was so striking. It's like, have we moved? Have we advanced at all?
Have we learned anything?
Yeah.
One of the amazing statistics in this book, statistics makes it sound so official, but one of the numbers that you mentioned that just really threw me for a loop was that in 1891, there were 11 men hanged in the largest mass lynching in the U.S. in New Orleans in 1891. They were not black, which you would think in the South. They were Italian. Yeah. Mass lynchings.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's remarkable how those things are papered over, a generation or two later. And that's, I think, to get back to what I was saying before about the issue between my grandfather and my father. What it comes down to is I grew up with the notion that my grandfather tried to pull his son, my father, into the business. And my father refused. He was, and in my mind, it was like he's doing that for us. I was little, I don't know how old I was, but he had a family and he was keeping us apart from that. What I learned was, in fact, it was exactly the opposite. My dad desperately wanted in, and my grandfather would just beat the crap out of him as a way of keeping him away from this. And I think the reason that he did that was because he knew, in his time, he didn't have a choice. But this is now the 1950s or 60s, and, that generation didn't have that same issue to deal with.
Yeah. Another surprise for me was how mundane and everyday the work of the mob was. Yeah. It was just part of daily life. Half the town played, at least. They probably knew they were getting screwed.
Well, if they're playing the numbers, you're not getting screwed any more than like playing a lottery. You are. I mean, of course, you're eventually gonna. But they didn't. The way they did the numbers, it's 3-digit number, and they used the last 3 digits of the New York Stock Exchange final number for the day. So you just opened up the newspaper, you looked at the last 3 numbers, and you knew if you won or not. So that was a way to assure that we're not playing with it, it's impartial.
It's a clean game.
Yeah, it's as clean as any lottery,
But I never realized that the mob had been such an accepted part of daily life. Yeah. And then the transition came to what my recollection of the mob was, a much more violent, much more overtly corrupt organization. Mm-hmm.
Well, J. Edgar Hoover, the famous director of the FBI for, I don't know how long, 28 years or something, denied, for most of that time, denied the existence of it.
Why? Why?
Various explanations have been put forth. He was more focused on the communist threat. Yeah. But a series of events. In 1957, they busted a gathering of mob leaders from like Kansas City and different sort of medium-sized towns in upstate New York. This made the newspapers, and he couldn't deny it anymore. There was clear evidence that they were actually working together. They were all gathering together and having a conference. So that then changed things. There were politicians in Washington and people in communities all around the country who were pushing for this to be recognized. And then in 1960, Kennedy runs, partly his brother, John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, campaigned. He had written a book a few years before about the mob in America and the need to crack down on it. And he became the Attorney General in the White House. So he had this commitment to crack down on it. That coincides with, in my little town, this murder that I was talking about. So suddenly, the Attorney General of the United States is on the phone with the mayor of this little town, and
saying, what happened to Pippi?
Yeah, exactly, and it was now a new mayor. The old mayor was the one who was taking the payoffs. This mayor, just like Kennedy, campaigned on we're going to clean this up. And so there he was able to do that, and suddenly you have FBI agents in the town. So you can see mirrored in the town what was happening, this change of how people perceived it.
And what happened to Johnstown after the mob was disbanded? How did the mob actually come to disappear? Was it because of the government crackdown? Or you mentioned other demographic changes that happened in that same period?
Yeah, I think all of the above. That crackdown was a big thing in scattering people. Then they slowly, come back together, but not the same. The mob is there because there's money. And what was starting to happen in the next phase of history is these towns that were producing, steel for the army during World War II and all that are slowly, that's being outsourced. It's going overseas, and they're slowly becoming Rust Belt towns. So Johnstown, the population was about 70,000, and now the new census figures, it's just over 18,000. So it's just a shell of what it was.
And has it fallen into poverty?
Yes, it's the poorest city in Pennsylvania. It has one of the highest opioid problems. And it's a story that you've read about in lots of other places in the U.S. And this is one aspect of that. So where's the mob's not going to be there? First of all, I think this the Italian mob that you have that image of in your head, however true or romanticized, was a function of the 20th century of immigration and discrimination and opportunity. And then it started to, as I was just saying, in these ways,
spiral
it started to disintegrate, and other ethnic gangs, and the picture just got more complicated.
But there was another societal sea change that also influenced the decline of the mob in Johnstown, and that was also something I had never considered in this context. People got TV.
Yeah. In 1951, 5% of American households had TV. 1960, 90% did.
So they stopped gambling?
And that's the span. That's when, through the early and mid 50s is when they were really raking it in. And then you can see that declining because, as I said, it's not very romantic or sexy to say that they made their money just on providing little amusement for people in the evenings, but that's basically what it was. And when people...
See, you make it sound very innocent again.
Yeah, but instead, when people just sit at home and watch, I Love Lucy or The Honeymooners, they don't have to go out and...
Ed the Talking Horse.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so, and that, who could resist that?
It's so funny. I immediately hear the signature tune of Mr. Ed when I say this.
Did you have Mr. Ed here? Mr. Ed here? That's right. Yeah.
As you said, of course, this was also a generational story. And thinking about writing a book like this, first kicking and screaming, I don't do this kind of history, and then realizing that it was a story that had to be told. And I really enjoyed reading not just the story itself, but how you tell the story. Perhaps because I'm a journalist and writer myself, and I really loved seeing how it spiraled from the social story, the immigration, the rise of the mob, and then gradually became a more and more personal story.
Yeah.
Were you able to keep control of this narrative, or did it shape itself? No book ever writes itself.
No. I believe in storytelling, and that means you really spend a lot of time in making a story that people want to read, and that, you know, you're going to leave a kind of a cliffhanger here, and then you know, introduce a whole new topic, and then we'll come back to it, and then there's a surprise. So you look for those things when
So there's a formula.
Well, I don't know if that's a formula, but there's I think a natural method which has to do with what naturally interests people, what pulls them in. So I believe in structuring it that way, and therefore, when you're doing the research, and someone gives you this piece, you know, I'm like, I'm going to use that. That's a great thing, because when this person told me that, I was so surprised. The reader's going to be surprised, but I have to know when to use it.
Yeah,
you know?
that's the composing of the story.
Yeah.
Did you go back? How different was the first draft from the 10th or however many final drafts?
I think I steadily accepted that that it had to be more personal. And you know, my father died not long before I finished. And honestly,
so he never read the book?
No. And honestly, I was in the hospital. He had died, and I knew how it ended. I knew how the book was going to end. Not exactly with that, but you know, one of those, you know, kind of classic elements of any storytelling is, you know, history just goes on and on and on and on. One way you decide what a story is, where you begin it and where you end it. And when you have that, then you can start to, you know, work with it. And so then, you know, the other side of that is realizing that it really is about these, you know, males interacting with or kind of colliding with each other from one generation, then the next, and then the next. So once, you know, at that point, I realized this is about him and me.
You had to admit that.
Yeah.
But it apparently took a long time, or perhaps you enhanced that for the dramatic effect, for you to realize how personal this story was.
Yeah, I think it did take a while, you know. I guess I
perhaps
fought it.
Because you'd always had this distance to your father that...
Yeah. I mean, try writing about your relationship with a parent, you know. I mean, maybe for some people it's easy, and try talking about it. You know, try saying to your mother or father, you know, there are things we never talk about. Let's talk about this. It's really, for me anyway, it's very hard to do that. So for example, when I said, when this guy, Mike Galino, told me, wait a second, you think your grandfather tried to bring your dad in and he resisted? You know, you're full of shit. You know, when he told me that, it was like 2 years from then till when I had the nerve to say to my dad, okay, Mike told me this, you know. And then when I did, it was kind of anticlimactic. He kind of said, yeah, it was, that's true. But, you know, I don't know.
That was all?
Well, yeah, I mean, then we talked about it. My mother then was there, and she chimed something in, and, you know. And, yeah, I mean, these things, you know, there are all these, and families build up these kind of walls, and you live within those walls. And if you're going to try to break down a wall or even put a window in or something, you know.
And you would never realize that this wall was there.
Right, exactly, yeah. So, you know, again, I just think doing this kind of thing, it's something everybody can do, anyone who has a family. And, you know, telling the stories, I became, I think, pretty good at getting people to go back, you know, because people have their way of talking about some momentous event in the past, but it's the same story they've told over and over, and it's gotten polished, and you know, you want to try to get past that. You want to get back to the real memories, not to the 100th telling of the same story. So, you know, you kind of, I mean, you're an interviewer, and you know how this works. You try to find ways to
tease something out that you haven't heard yet.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the recorder just kept going and going.
Yeah, and when it's a family member, that's maybe all the more difficult or tricky. But, you know, sometimes people have just been waiting to be asked. Nobody's ever asked, and as soon as you do, out comes, you know.
So your father, unfortunately, passed away before he was able to read the book, but I'll bet the rest of Johnstown has read it.
I didn't know how the town would react, even if anybody would care. And it's really gotten a tremendous reaction there. It's really
tremendous as in
tremendously good.
Good or?
Yeah, no, tremendously good. I've gotten zillions of emails from people in town as well as other places. One whole, you know, one thing that surprised me was how many people it resonates with who are not from an Italian family in Western Pennsylvania, but are from an Irish family in Illinois or something, because there's a lot of similarity between in these different immigrant stories, and people remembering the way their grandparents would do something and then everybody would fall silent or whatever. So the town, yeah, it's there's a restaurant group in town that has now, that the building that was the cigar shop has been vacant for, like a lot of downtown, for a long time. A restaurant group has bought it and they're turning it into a cigar bar, which I think is really cool. And the town history center has organized a mob walk, so they could do walking. They can do walking tours. So it's really, really nice that
Are you getting a cut, I hope?
Hélas.
Hélas. Was there nobody of your family who took exception to the book, who was angry?
No, there are. Most people in my family, I have to say, either in the beginning, wanted me to do this, or were happy to be interviewed and to help me to meet other people and so on. There were a couple of people who really didn't want this from the beginning, because everybody, you're exposing things.
All your dirty linen?
Yeah, and I knew that. We talked about it. We talked about it at different times. When I wrote a draft, I sent it to them, even though I knew they weren't going to like it. And, I had to think about that, and I've talked with friends who are writers who've written memoirs who've had similar experiences where, there's some people in your family maybe are never going to speak to you again or something.
You decided to forge ahead.
Yeah, my conclusion is that you have a right to your way of dealing with your family and your past, and I have a right to tell my story, because it's really my story. I mean, someone else would assemble all these same facts and do it differently, So, but I have a right to tell my story, so that's where I came. Plus, I had a contract and I owed a book to my publishers.
That helps, and a deadline helps too.
Right.
As you got to know more about this evasive character who was very quiet, your grandfather, you started to see two sides to his career and also to his personality. There was the cheat, which was what he did best, and there was also his role as a company man.
Yeah.
You said in the mob. It was like he was the, I don't know, CFO.
Yeah, he ran a business.
He was a businessman.
Yeah, and one of the so I said at the beginning that he had these huge problems with alcohol and with women on the side, and
let's say some more about those women, because I must say I was so impressed how this man managed to juggle all these affairs and children, and of course he had his wife and the kids, and then he had his first mistress, whom he brought into their home as the housekeeper. And then he had a child with her, and he let somebody else, a couple, bring the child up, and then he had an affair with a woman of that couple, and she had a child with him.
Okay, I think I've lost you, but okay.
Isabella and Vicky.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, you write about how he was falling apart, starting to drink. He actually got fired from the mob because he couldn't do his job well anymore. But he managed to keep all of this sort of organized.
Yeah, it's so what I concluded, to get to your earlier question, is that people, including my father, they had these memories of him as a cheat and how good he was. And that's a different thing. I mean, you kind of jumble all this together in your mind, but that's one way of operating. That's one kind of underworld activity. But running a mob franchise is, as you say, it's running a business. You have a payroll and all of that. They had something like 100 people as numbers runner.
And he had a great eye for numbers.
Yes, he was apparently very good with math. And those two things, so his natural tendency, his natural talent, this is just me making it up, I don't know this, was, as a cheat. And I think he loved that. But because of circumstances, he became the the number two man to his brother-in-law in this business. And it was a lot of money. It was millions of dollars. Some people estimated $40 million over 20 years. In the 1950s, whenever.
370 million by today's count.
Yeah. That pressure maybe was too much for him, and that's why he started these other things, and and just sort of gave himself over to other things, which had the terrible effects on my grandmother, who I did know really well, and. So now you try to look at through my child's eyes all the time I spent with her and what she was going through with what I now know.
Where did all that money go, Russell?
Yeah, I've talked to other people who were
370 million.
Yeah.
But they weren't flashy types. They didn't drive around in Cadillacs and fur coats.
Yeah, I've talked to other people like mob historians and other people who. Their family did something similar in other towns. And it was the same story over and over. One thing I can surmise is they did not take courses in money management, these guys.
They didn't have notebooks.
And they spent like mad. You're right, they had this, you were not allowed to drive a Cadillac, and your suits had to come off the rack. They couldn't be, tailored suits. But when you left, they would be in Florida, they would be at Atlantic City, and then you would rent the whole floor of the swankiest hotel in town, and you'd go out to the nightclub all night. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that they would just spread it around. Many people told me that your grandfather would come into a diner downtown and to have lunch, and he would just buy everybody's lunch, or
without telling them.
Then they would find out later.
Oh, really?
Oh, no, respite. And he would apparently just he knew somebody who was a mill worker or whatever who had a smart kid. He would pay for the college.
So they were also philanthropists in their own local way.
In their own way. This story again. I say this is really, in a way, part of the story of America in the 20th century, and. It's really a story of haves and have-nots. There were, it was a really clear class system with all the hot shots, the big shots, and then the regular workers and their families. And everybody I talked to in town who remembered those days had mostly good feelings about them. They felt that they were on their side. And things like this, that's when they would bring up stories like this. And I don't know that, if they were trying to be clever to keep people on their side, okay, that's one possibility. But I kind of think they were that's how they made themselves feel important, by tossing money around. And
it's a very American story, isn't it? It is really the ultimate rags to riches story, being so heavily discriminated against and lynched and looked down on. And then creating a business with, what kind of business? Okay, but with an amount of capital in it like this is extraordinary.
Yeah, that's what I came to see, that it's, it's an Italian-American story, but and that's what other people helped me to see as readers as they started to communicate with me, that it was, Hungarians, Jews, Irish, there were similarities. And again, it was just part of the fabric of the 20th century was the American century, and this was, immigration was one part of that, and these, you put all those things together, and then you look at it how those forces are at work in your own family. That's what I was doing in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah. So as you said, family history is history.
Yeah, because the war is going on, whoever's president. As I said, there were direct connections between what was going on in Washington and in this little town, and how those things play off each other.
So this microcosm is actually a macrocosm at the same time.
Exactly. The smaller a story is, the bigger it is. The smaller you get on one love story, Romeo and Juliet. It's eternal. Who cares about these two teenagers in Italy in the 1500s? Well, it kind of resonates.
It becomes universal.
Exactly.
And so now you've had your first dangerous taste of the apple. of living history, people in living memory.
Would I do something else?
Are you going to continue with
I'd
this?
like to in the future. I don't have a story in mind. I like these, you know, it's really fun working with people and their memories, I like the kind of, you know, the title Smalltime to me was there right away. I just like the small seediness of it. So I like small, seedy stories in living memory. I don't know what. I'll do something else maybe. You know?
You like con men too.
Con men, yeah. There's this con that I spent maybe too many pages on because it didn't directly have to do with my grandfather. This guy who conned all these like big shot doctors and lawyers out of hundreds of thousands of dollars with this box that he did, and just the the idea of the nerve. And he was telling me, this guy was telling me how he did it. He was really into it, and he got busted. The FBI wiretaps and time in prison and all that, but he just still relished the doing of it.
He was proud of it.
And the idea to, you know, stare at someone who you know you're just going to steal money from and tell your story and sell it to, you know.
Advise them on how to invest it.
I think because I could never in a million years do that, I find it fascinating. You know?
Because you don't have any of the con men.
I don't think I have that.
Oh, all right, okay. Well,
Maybe
as
I envy it.
Maybe, yeah. That ballsy,
yeah.
Well, as I said, it's a wonderful book. How many of you have read it already? Oh, wonderful.
Right.
Oh, you recognize so much. And for the people who haven't read it yet, I'm very sorry that I've given so much away. But you'll still enjoy it. There's time for questions. You'll just have to stand up and shout, and then I'll repeat the question.
Up there on the right, Tracy.
Yeah, I'll just shout really loud. So.
Okay.
My question sort of elaborates on a question that's been asked about the storytelling. And I was just wondering, a lot has been said about acquiring new points of view on your family, on your grandfather specifically. And I was just wondering if you sort of regained a new appreciation for your family history in general.
Yes, indeed.
Let me repeat the question for the tape and the live stream about the storytelling and whether you've hereby gained a new appreciation for your father and grandfather.
Yeah, for you know, maybe it sounds trite, but I think part of the reason that you research and do your family history is to understand yourself better. You know, I think when you're young, you think of yourself, at least with me, you know, I'm pushing all that away. I actually went from college, I went to Japan. I lived in Tokyo. It was like, I'm going to get as far away from all that as I can. And eventually, you know, as you get older, you start to recognize that actually that is part of me somehow.
And now you live an hour from Johnstown.
Exactly, yeah. But I might be, you never don't know. I might be back here at some point.
Oh, okay. I hope so.
Yeah.
Yes, could you stand up?
Yeah, sure. Hello, Russell.
Hey.
I'm Jerry.
Hi, Jerry. How are you doing?
Do you consider that the mafia at this moment is considered a cancer in our society, and that, you know, from the poor immigrants to the States with Catholic morals has deteriorated into a criminal organization without any morals being recognized and accepted?
Yeah, well, sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
Do you consider, Russell, that the mafia is now a cancer in our society and that the morals, if it had any, have deteriorated?
Yeah, well, I guess my answer is to do with, you know, these terms mafia and mob and organized crime. You know, I'm in no way condoning organized crime. I was trying to describe a phenomenon that I was reading about and hearing about that happened in these towns in the mid-20th century. It evolved and devolved into other things. So you have the Italian mafia in Italy and Sicily, the extent to which there is a mob in New York and in Boston and places like that, organized crime here that you read about periodically, you know, and it's such a peaceful society here that it just reverberates when there's one of these murders. These are all related things. I feel that they're mostly different from this phenomenon that I was describing, but they overlap. And as I said, the degree of violence is one thing, and there certainly was that in this story too, but in a smaller way. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but yeah, I mean, I think organized crime, so-called, is a kind of cancer on society. I also would say that I've come to feel that big business operates in many ways a lot like organized crime. It just is, when they do it, they pay off the politicians, it's okay. But if somebody else does it who's in an ethnic gang, then it's not okay. No, it doesn't make it any better. No, of course. And therefore, the cancer metaphor.
Yeah. Who else? Hello.
I've read your book and found it very interesting. I have the impression that you consider this way of integration, assimilation, the only way an Italian could become an American. Am I correct in my assumption?
I think I know what he's going to say, but we'll see. Is this way of assimilation the only possible way that the Italians could have become more rooted in American society?
No. No,
What else could they have done?
Yeah, well, I
under
mean,
these
I can
circumstances?
understand. I'm not trying to look at it and draw those kind of conclusions. What I was doing is simply describing what happened. And that didn't necessarily happen. Not every Italian, became part of the mob. But there were these forces of discrimination, and you see it when you gather your evidence and you see these channels that people are kind of flowing into, and how someone like my grandfather, I came to feel a certain amount of sympathy for him, which really surprised me. But I don't by any means say that that's how it must happen, or American society was structured so that that's the only way it could happen. But you can see how those forces meant that this became a kind of cancer eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yes, first here and then here. Hi. Could you stand up, please?
Yes. I wonder, because you did such a deep dive in your family,
Yeah.
and what motivated your father and your grandfather, if that changed anything for you, because that has a conscious and a subconscious effect on your character, what motivates you in life, just kind of the therapeutic layer of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Did that change anything for you, or are you still processing?
The question is whether this deep dive into your family history changed you in any way, a therapeutic effect perhaps, or a subconscious effect on you?
Yes, and I think you're right that it's still, it's going to take time to process. I have 3 children and 3 stepchildren, and so, when you are looking back and looking at all these dynamics in your family past, you almost inevitably are thinking about all of that, those relationships, how you are as a parent, and then, to what extent those things, I don't have an answer, but to what extent those things don't necessarily have to do with choices you make as a parent. But, it's just things happen in families. And, just as an example, there's the Sicilian tradition of naming, which I wasn't fully aware of. The first son names his first son after the father. So Antonino, the immigrant, named his son Rosario, who became Russell. And then he named his son, my father, Anthony. And then he named me Russell. And so I have a 12-year-old son who I named Anthony. I kind of felt I couldn't help it. I had to. So.
Yes, please.
Actually, it was a very similar type of question. How much were you yourself changed by learning this history about your father and grandfather? They're part of you and you're part of them.
Yeah.
Did you feel your own personality traits might have changed by learning so much about them?
Yeah, I think
how much did you feel that this learning about your family this way changed you?
Yeah. I think that it changes me. Maybe to a certain extent, it's along with the process of getting older. You just feel, you allow yourself to feel these things and accept things in a way that before you tried to push them away or you battled with them. And so I think that I'm, especially my relationship with my father. I mean, that's, such an elemental thing. And it was, as I said before, it was really hard to, there's things I could say to all of you right now about him, but could I do that with him? You know what I mean? At the time, it's so hard and so getting better at that, I think helps to kind of, helps you to relax into who you are maybe a little bit.
Has it changed your relationship with your own son, with Anthony?
I'll have to ask him that. He's very interested in the book.
In a few years. Has he read it?
Yeah, he's read some of it, and then he stopped and he said, you said the F word in the book.
And that was a reason to stop reading?
No, I think it just got a little, I don't know, it wasn't quite, he wasn't quite ready for it.
No, but I'm sure it will.
But all the other kids have read it, which is great. And, and they all helped, not all of them, but most of them helped transcribing interviews, editing. Eva, my daughter, is a tremendous editor, and giving her drafts, and she was so honest and to a fault. Because it's her father, she would write down the whole margin. I am so bored. and she has other.
Thank you, Eva.
She has other clients who she edits for, and I said, I hope you don't do this with them.
So it was actually a family undertaking.
Yeah, it was.
Oh,
it really was.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Generations were involved, and a lot of people chipped in and helped out in all kinds of ways. Yeah, and I think part of the reason is what I said at the very beginning about we all kind of internalized, we don't talk about that, but everybody had their sense of what they knew about the story, but it was frozen. That's all they had, is that little window. And so they all were kind of curious about what I would come up with so they could see what it was, because they didn't know. We all had a very limited glimpse onto it.
One last question? Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, should we keep going? Are you bored? All right. Hey, Glenn, we'll keep going. First, the blonde lady and then the lady in the blue blouse. Oh, gray, okay. You look blonde from here.
Tell something about the role of your mother in the whole period of research and also what did she think about the result. And there was very much attention for your father. Did you feel a bit jealous maybe?
Okay. The question was, could you say something about your mother and her role in this whole story, and what she thought of the result, and maybe she was a bit jealous about all the attention for your father?
I don't know if she was jealous. I haven't asked. I'll have to ask her that. But my mother was one of these people who was involved the whole way. That my parents' story is part of this story. They married very young, so she came on the scene. And actually part of what I write about later in the book is how, she got pregnant with me when they were teenagers, and they ran off to get married without telling anyone. So my grandfather wanted to take me. Because he was used to moving kids around that, he had fathered, so he was just going to take me.
And do what with you?
They were too young, so he and my grandmother would raise me. And so, my mother was involved in the story, both in helping to unpack these things and as a kind of participant. I think she, like me, like everyone who was actually involved in it, had her... we talked about this over a number of years, and there were stories that I had heard from earlier when I was a teenager or something. And the stories changed a little bit, and I said, Mom, I remember you told me it differently back then. So, we're all involved when you do this, and if you do it over a period of time and really extensively, it's like you're all involved in this dance together, and your memories are dancing, and so she was part of that. the whole story about my father, because she was on the scene when that happened, when my father was, wanted to be part of it and then couldn't. So she had her memories of that. And just since you bring up my mother, the women in the family, that side of the story, it was to me just really important, and it frustrated me so much that I knew my grandmother well, but she was long gone by the time I started working on this. And she would, my grandfather was kind of pushed out of the family, and it was around the time I was like 5, 6 years old. And so he was pushed out of their house. And my mother had all these little kids. I was the oldest. And so she would often just drop me off at my grandmother's house, and I would spend the day or days with her. And she would dote on me, and she would kind of talk to me about, she would complain to me about some of these things in a way. And I just thought she's kind of riffing on this. And she would chain smoke Pall Mall cigarettes. She had a big quart bottle of Schmitt's beer always in a little beer glass. And she would do, and I just sat there and hung out with her. And I thought it was nice. And she was really, really a sweet woman, incredibly pained. And I knew that when I was that old. And, it only when I was working on the book did I realize that she had, in a way, exchanged one Russell Shorto for another, but she was such a, learning what I could about her backstory after the fact, really strong woman, and then to have to endure this. And I said to other women in the family, why didn't she just leave him? And they all said the same thing. You didn't do that, So it was finally, things got to a head where they sort of, my father, people in the family kind of pushed him out, so.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, the title of the book, why is it called Smalltime? Can you explain that?
Are you going to repeat?
Sorry. Can you explain the title of the book, Smalltime?
Smalltime in American argot is just like not the big time. It's just the little stuff. This isn't New York. It's not Broadway. This is some little, in that town, the amounts of money, and all of that was a big thing at the time. But it's, that's getting at the whole idea of how this played out in small towns around the country.
Okay. Oh, goodness. I see 5 hands, but we're not going to have time for all of those. So the lady right there, and then the lady behind you.
I was wondering, as part of growing up as an American is always a sort of hyphenated identity, the Italian-American, and how has finding out more about being part of the actual mob, the Italian mob, changed the way you view yourself, maybe as a hyphenated American?
A lot of growing up in America, is about the hyphenated identity, Italian-American, and how has learning about your family and the mob changed your view of yourself as an Italian-American?
As I said before, I knew this from early on. I knew that was in the background, and I think that's why I know that's why I never wanted to see a Godfather movie. I never wanted to watch The Sopranos, because it just felt like, I'm involving myself in this very corny stereotype. And I just wanted to, as I said before, I wanted to go to Japan. I want to avoid all that. But coming at it like this was actually quite refreshing, because for me, I was sort of exploding that stereotype. It was mundane, and it was, here's where they did this, and here's where they had a craps game, and it was just like it was a way of connecting yourself to the town and the way it flowed, and the way. That's why I read that passage from Frank. How it fit in with everything in the town. So it's kind of helps you to integrate.
Yes. Last question. Oh, that's a great last question.
Yeah.
What would it take to bring you back to Amsterdam? And what do you miss?
You know, I just
Maybe you could become the director of the John Adams.
Right. We'll just keep trading back and forth. I don't know. I just feel like I'm home when I'm here, and being away for almost 2 years, it really soon. People kept saying to me, "Oh, it's so changed. There's so much new construction. You're not going to recognize." I came back. Everything seems exactly. It's like I know. I could close my eyes and go through. So
That's what we call nostalgia, Russell.
Yeah. Well, but I'm here, and it's I mean, things annoy me too, don't get me wrong. But what would it take? Well, right now, one of the reasons we moved was to be around at this stage in life to help with our parents. And, my mother's around and my wife's parents, and our son is 12, and, you kind of don't want to uproot him. And probably I couldn't afford to move back now anyway. But at some point in the not too distant future, you develop a book. But that's my excuse for how I orient my life. I have a book project. Well, I've got a book. I have to go there. So,
We think it's a great idea. I'd like to make some closing remarks. And the first of them, of course, is to thank Russell for this extraordinary story and for the wonderful way you tell us about it. And I'm so glad that this is in the world now after all these years of internal research and soul searching, and also in the police records with a stack this high of your granddad's arrest records. Just a couple words about upcoming events at the John Adams. On September 29th, we're hosting Patrick Radden Keefe. And you may not have heard of him, but don't let that stop you. He is wonderful. He's a writer for The New Yorker, and he's also an author. He's written a fabulous book called Empire of Pain about the opioid crisis in the US and about the role in it of the Sackler family. And just 10 days ago, it was announced that the Sackler family has agreed to pay $5 billion in fines in return for not being prosecuted. And if you know how large the fortune is of the Sackler family, you might feel a spark of indignation about this. Our moderator that evening will be Elko Bos van Rosenthal. And he also told me that it's a fantastic book. I'm reading it now myself. And Patrick Radden Keefe is also a podcast maker, and he made the podcast Wind of Change. Has anybody heard it? It's fantastic. It's about the song Wind of Change by the Scorpions. Do you hear it in your head? And the idea is that this... Yes! I hear somebody whistling it. Isn't it fantastic that the song would be a ploy by the CIA to get the Scorpions to perform in Eastern Europe, and that this would be their way of subverting communism? I'm not going to tell you anymore. Listen, it's fantastic. We also have a couple events coming up for which we don't have dates yet, but I wanted you to know what we're working on. We will be hosting one or two of the authors of the book, The Ugly Truth, about Facebook. And they worked on this for quite some time, but then it lay on the shelf for a year while the New York Times and the lawyers of Facebook fought it out. But it has now appeared. It's also out in translation. In January, we hope to host Shoshana Zuboff, who is an emeritus professor at the Harvard Business School, who wrote a really impactful book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is also about the business model and the algorithms behind all the tech companies that pretty much rule our lives for us. And then also in January, we're working together with the Royal Concertgebouw Orkest. They have a 3-week festival lined up called Made in America. And we hope to do the opening event with them. I won't tell you what or the date yet because we're still working on it, but keep an eye on our website, sign up for our newsletter if you don't have it yet, so that you won't miss any of these wonderful events. And I have news for you. I have been waiting for months to tell this to you, and I couldn't because you weren't here, and neither were we. But now you're here, and so am I, so I want to tell you our news. We are starting a podcast. We'll be starting it hopefully at the end of this year. The first season has 10 episodes, which have been edited and voiced. I don't know what the right English word is for that, by Jonathan Gruber, who is actually here this evening. He has a wonderful voice. He's a great There you are. Hey, Jonathan. And the podcast will be called Bright Minds. And some of them will be speakers from our treasure trove of archives, people who have been at the John Adams through the last decades. And also some of our new speakers will be in there. So we're starting our first season of 10 episodes at the end of this year, the beginning of next. And I hope that you'll listen and subscribe and enjoy it. And I hope to see you back very, very soon. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Russell, for being here.
Thanks. That was lovely. Thank you.
Wasn't that great?
Beautifully done. Yeah, thank you.